What's up everyone, it's LolElekktro, and this video is going to go in depth on the key aspects of pivoting and transitioning. This topic has been my most highly requested video for some time now, because knowing how to transition and pivot properly is probably the most advanced skill you can have in TFT. I'm going to try to explain how you would normally transition your comp in a traditional game, as well as showcase the core aspects of why you might want to pivot. There's going to be a lot of information in this video, so let's just get right into it. First thing to mention is that in the early game, you're mostly looking to put your strongest units on the board and aren't too focused on synergies yet. What is valuable about this, in terms of pivoting, is that you likely have a bunch of units on the board that don't have any synergies yet. Once you start getting synergies on your bench, you don't necessarily want to start replacing your 2-star units yet, because in the rounds before Krugs, having multiple 2-star units with no synergies is always going to be better than multiple 1-star units with synergies. This is key to the first stages of transitioning. 2-star units are significantly better at utilizing items in the early game, regardless of synergies. So let's say that you're able to build 1 or 2 of the A to S tier items. You're going to want to throw that on your strongest unit, preferably one that is 2 stars. If you want an in-depth guide on how to build a team comp in the early game, I have a guide on my channel you should watch that is all about that topic. But for those who haven't seen it, one of the key things I talk about is building up a strong bench with a wide range of potential synergies as you approach the Krug round. After Krug round, you should have a pretty good idea of what comp you're going to be able to play. But one of the key problems people run into is what to do with the current units that they have on the board that don't synergize with their comp. If you have a 2-star unit on the board who is currently holding all of your items, you don't want to sell that unit until you have another unit on the board that can better utilize those items. For example, let's say you decided to run a sorcerer comp and have Kassadin, Lulu, and Veigar on the board, but you also have a 2-star Garen sitting on the board with a Morellonomicon. None of the current members of your sorcerer comp can use that item effectively, so there is just more value in keeping the Garen than getting rid of him right now. Sometimes it is best to put your items on units that you're not looking to keep long term. Once you get a unit that can better utilize those items and fits better into your team comp, you can sell that random unit and replace them with a stronger unit. In this case, let's say you have a Garen with Morello as a placeholder on the board until you get a Kennen. Kennen would not only give your team Yordle buff in this example, but he can also utilize Morello very well. So, upon purchasing Kennen, it would be a good idea to swap out the Garen and put the items on Kennen. You don't want to put Morello on, in this example, Veigar, because he is a key member of your comp, and you would have to sell him later to put Morello on a unit that can better utilize it, since he doesn't use Morello effectively. The same logic applies to replacing 2-star units with your synergy units regardless of items. Every round you should be asking yourself, what is the strongest I can be at this current point? Even if you have a comp in mind, sometimes you need to get your synergy units to 2 stars before you can even consider replacing the current placeholder units. The key takeaway of this point is that you want to always be looking to maximize your power, and sometimes rushing into the comp you want to run isn't the best way to maximize power. Play for power early by going for 2-star units and early synergies like Knight or Wild buff, and replace them when you have the units that synergize best with the comp you've decided on. Now that we've looked at how to transition out of the early game, let's look at why we might want to pivot once our comp starts going. Before I continue with this point, the most important thing you should know is that you are never 100% locked into a comp. With that in mind, let's continue onto the benefits of scouting. Scouting is a major part of being able to pivot because it allows you to get ahead of the game and start making adjustments to your comp. I am usually doing this at all points of the game, but it is especially helpful to do this at level 6 or beyond because that is when most players have transitioned into their comps. If in the early game, you didn't see a lot of players running sorcerer comp, and you were getting a bunch of sorcerer units, you might have made the decision to commit to that comp. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you aren't getting any hits and it seems like none of the units you need are showing up. This happens a lot to people because in the early game, most players are playing for strength and not synergies, so it is hard to read what they might transition into. If you're getting a lot of one type of synergy early game, it might be because other players haven't fully transitioned into their comps yet. However, around level 6, you'll find that everyone's comp has started to come online, and all of a sudden, there are 2 to 3 other players running your exact same comp. This is where it is important to start pivoting, and the first step to knowing when to pivot is by scouting. The most effective way to scout so that you aren't caught off guard by other players running your same comp is by following these 3 steps. For point number 1, make sure you have a keybind for looking at other players because it makes it much more quick and efficient to look at what other players are running rather than just clicking their portraits every time. For point number 2, pay attention to every player's bench and not just the units that they have on the board. If a player is playing for power early game, they likely have other synergies on their bench that they could potentially transition into but aren't currently using. If you're able to spot this early, you won't get caught off guard when you see other players transitioning into your comp. For the last point, you want to pay attention to their gold income after looking at their bench. If you see that they are in the infancy of running a sort comp for example, but they also have bad economy, you shouldn't worry too much about them as a competitor because they still have a long ways to go before they're a problem to you. Remember, scouting is extremely important, but it is also easy to neglect it and get lazy. So if you're trying to learn how to pivot, you need to make scouting a habit of yours. Now, onto the main event when it comes to pivoting, and that is pivoting late game. Everything I said up until now is extremely relevant and must be kept in mind so you understand the core fundamentals of pivoting and why you might need to do it. The question now is, what do I do when I realize I need to pivot my comp? Well, the answer goes back to the statement I made earlier about never being 100% locked into a team comp. You have to play every game considering the possibility that you might have to change your team comp down the road. With that being said, remember that most team comps are solidified by the 4 cost and 5 cost units that they need. Also remember that there are only 13 total 4 cost units of the same type in the pool, as well as only 10 5 cost units of the same type. As an example, there are only 13 Akalis per game and only 10 Karthuses per game. This is extremely important when you consider the value that 4 to 5 cost units have on a comp overall. Usually, as you play through the game, you are building a comp which will eventually lead to you getting a hit on a high cost unit that you can then transition into your comp, leading to a massive power spike. However, let's say you're running a sort comp that is heavily reliant on getting a Karthus. Well, not only do you have a 0.5% chance at level 6 to get a 5 cost unit, there is also only 10 of them total in the pool, so if there are 2 or 3 other players in the game also looking for a Karthus, the likelihood that you'll be able to get one without losing too much gold or health is pretty low. Also, if you do happen to get a Karthus, you can kiss 2-star Karthus goodbye until one or more of the other players running him has died. So what do you do if the situation happens to you? Well, as you transition into late game, I would suggest that every time you see a 4 cost or 5 cost unit show up in your cards, you ask yourself whether or not you could potentially use that unit in the future. Players tend to devalue 4 cost units that they don't need, forgetting how rare and useful they can be to the completion of a comp. If it becomes obvious to you that running a full sort comp with Karthus as your main carry isn't realistic, you can start to look at other units. A very common pivot I see people doing right now is when players have Kennen in their comp, either for his synergies as a Yordle or a Ninja. When they aren't finding too many hits with those synergies, they might start looking for units like Brand or Lysandra, and even a Nivea if they are lucky. If those characters end up just sitting on the bench for a while, it still gives the player the option to add elementals to their comp if necessary. You don't always have to commit to elementals just because you bought them, but it is about giving yourself the versatility to not just sit there and continue losing rounds because you can't find your units. Elementals aren't the only things you can add to your comp in a pivot, albeit they are probably one of the best pivot synergies. You can also potentially transition into Imperials if you're running a Blade Master comp, or potentially transition into Ninja Elementals if you find yourself running an Elemental Sorcerer comp. It is really about giving yourself the highest opportunity for success, and sometimes buying random 4 and 5 cost units can have a huge reward even if it doesn't seem obvious at first. I'm not going to go into all the different types of comps and what comps are the best to pivot into, because that would just double the length of the video. However, the key fundamentals to knowing how to pivot comes down to how you play around the 4 and 5 cost units you are given. Final thing I want to say before I say goodbye is that you should not allow yourself to get stuck in a single-minded mentality when playing this game. Just because you have a comp in mind doesn't mean that comp is ride or die. Sometimes you just don't get the hits for the comp you're committing to running. But instead of letting yourself die out slowly and hoping you just get lucky, use your skills of perception and consider what comps you might be able to transition into that can save your game.